All right, everyone. Welcome to the first part of a new short course that I'm doing called the Introduction to Insect Taxonomy. In this course, I wanted to start laying the foundation of your understanding of how insects are classified. Um, to do that, today we're going to start with how all taxonomy works, how we rank groups of animals and plants, um, and how our naming conventions work for those groups. So hopefully by the end of this, when you see the scientific name of something or the scientific name of a group of organisms, you will immediately be able to understand, oh, I kind of know where the taxonomic rank we're talking about, how big of a group of organisms we're talking about. That's the goal for this first part. Eventually, what we'll end up doing is going through all of the major groups, all of the major orders of insects, but we'll also be going through like all of the classes of the relevant arthropods, and the evolutionary history of these creatures, as well as we can kind of piece together. So to start off with, we need to go, kind of back to the biology 101 sort of introduction to taxonomy. How do taxonomic ranks of animals and plants work? How big of a group are we talking about when we're talking about each of these ranks? How scientific naming works? Our common consensus on how we will name things. We always give scientific names in either Latin or Greek. The specified suffixes of each group, things like that. So first we got to start there. So in taxonomy, so this is the kind of the science of naming things, if you will. That's kind of nomenclature, but the science of naming and organizing animals and plants into groups. We try to follow an evolutionary history of these things, and we're constantly shifting things about in biology as far as like, oh, is this beetle that we've known about for years really in the genus we think it is in? But for these higher categories, it's pretty well documented or pretty well maintained about the characteristics of each of these groups. So each of these groups, starting up here and moving down, this is the domain is the broadest group of organisms, and then we get more specific. And then down here is an individual species. For something to be in kingdom, Animalia or whatever, it has to have all of the characteristics of the thing above it. So, for instance, all species in this genus also have to have all the characteristics of the family and the order and the class. So how this works is more and more specific characterization of an organism so that it maintains all of the characteristics identified in the taxonomic rank above it. So what are these categories that we're interested in? So starting at the most basic, which we up here at domain, we generally recognize three domains of creatures. You have the eukarya. Let's make that smaller so it's a little less grainy. Eukaryotes, you have the prokaryotes, and the archaea. So the archaea are the most primitive. The archaea are otherwise known as the archaeobacteria. These are extremely primitive bacteria that live in extremely harsh conditions. They have very, very primitive cellular structures. You'll usually find them in things like underwater thermal vents and hot springs, things like that. The prokaryotes are things which are organisms that that everyone would recognize as kind of the more common bacteria. These are the bacteria that make you sick. These are the bacteria that rot your food, stuff like that. And then the eukaryotes are things with actual nuclei. So prokaryotes are bacteria which don't have nuclei or true nuclei, and eukaryotes are things with true nuclei. So these are all of the other organisms. So the eukaryotes would be all of the animals, all of the plants, all of the fungi, um, things like that. So eukaryotes are the largest thing that we're going to be talking about. Within kingdom is the next step down, right? So let's say that we're talking about all the eukaryotes. So what are we talking about within the eukaryotes? Generally speaking, within the eukaryotes, we're talking about three things. We're either talking about plants, plantae, animalia, or the fungi. So we assume off the bat when we're talking about this. So let's say that we're talking about domain eukarya. So now we're talking about either the plants, the animals, or the fungi. Within the kingdoms of eukaryotes, there are the plantae, the animalia, and the fungi. So in this case, when we're talking about insects, everything that we're going to be talking about are the animalia. Within the animals, there are then a bunch of other categories, so subcategories, the phyla. So of the phyla, there are tons of phyla. And when we're talking about animals, the phyla is where we begin talking about, like, oh, what are the different kinds of animals, right? So if you were to think of the most broad sorts of categorizations of animals, those would be the phyla. And there are a lot of them that you've probably never heard of that don't have common names and stuff. But if we wanted to talk about the most common of the animal phyla, we would have things like the porifera. These would be things with pores. So when we're talking about that, we mean sponges. So if you weren't aware, sponges are in fact a type of animal. They are made up of animal cells. They are kind of a colony animal. But they are the most simple animal, and they are defined by having their pores. We also have, so going back a little bit, I want to make sure I'm clear on this. So all of these groups have characteristics in common, which make them their own distinct kingdoms. So for instance, plants have, so all three of these groups have true nuclei, these sorts of eukaryotic cell structures. That's what makes them eukaryotes. All of the plants have things like cell walls. They tend to have plastids, so these are the types of chloroplasts or secondary and tertiary plastids. The fungi have their own kind of cell wall. So plant cell walls are made up of cellulose. Fungal cell walls are made up of chitin. They tend to be either decomposers or parasitic. So plants can, because they have plastids, they can make their own food. Animals and fungi can't. Animals tend to not have, or they don't have cell walls at all. They are incapable of making their own food. They tend to be mobile for the most part, or they tend to have a mobile life stage. So something like fungi aren't really mobile, but plants are pretty much completely immobile. There is another group in here that I should have put in, which is the protista, which is not really a group. The protists are something that we talk about a lot in biology, but the protists as a group are really a number of different groups combined. These tend to be this sort of single cell animal-like creatures. So these are single-celled organisms that tend to feed on other single-celled organisms. These are the squirmy, wiggly amoeboids and ciliates that you might see in pond water and stuff like that. But I'm not going to go into the taxonomy of protists because it's a hot mess. So anyway, so when we're talking about animals, we're talking about mobile or at least partially mobile creatures with no cell walls that are incapable of making their own food. So within that group, we have like the porifera. So these are the sea sponges. We also have the cnidaria, which are things with stingers and tentacles. So these are the things like sea anemones and jellyfish and hydras and coral. You don't think of coral as being related to jellyfish, but they do. Coral can sting you. They have tentacled immature stages, things like that. Generally, when we think of coral, we think of their rock-like stages, but there are free-swimming versions of life stages of coral. You have the platyhelminthes, These are the flatworms. These are probably those things that as a kid you were told you could cut in half and they'd grow two of them, which is true. You have things like the annelids, which are Annelida, which is getting closer to insects. These are things like earthworms. These are segmented worms, leeches, things like that. You have mollusks, which the mollusca are, I mean, everyone knows mollusca. These are the snails and the slugs and clams and oysters and cuttlefish and squid and octopi. They have, a muscular foot. Generally, they have some sort of tentacle. Soft-bodied, generally have some sort of shell or rudimentary shell structure. And then you have, let's skip to a bigger one, chordata. This is you. The chordates are things with spinal cords. So when we talk about is it a vertebrate or an invertebrate? Everything over here is an invertebrate, and then the chordates, there is a group called the vertebrata in it, and those are what we call the vertebrates, but almost all animals are invertebrates. And then finally we have the arthropods. So the Arthropoda, this is the phylum that we're most interested in. These are the crustaceans and the insects and the spiders and scorpions and the centipedes and the millipedes and all that. So these are things with jointed legs. The arthropods represent 80% of all animals. This is the largest groups of animals, largely because of the insect, or largely because of the insects. So this is a huge, huge group. So what about arthropods? What do they have in common? So like I said, they have the segmented legs, or they have segmented joints. They have exoskeletons made up of chitin. They are they have three different styles of mouth parts, but they're some sort of chewing, tearing mouth parts for the most part. And they also have all of the characteristics of all of the animals, right? So they have no cell walls. They have eukaryotic cell structures. They have mobile life stages. They're incapable of making their own food. So that is what we're interested in here. Phylum Arthropoda. And then this is where we get into the insects. So what are the classes of the arthropods? This would be the big one that we actually care about is class Insecta, right? So this is the big class, Insecta. But there are other classes within the arthropods. There are, is this technically a class, Chelicerata? It's a subphylum. So things get a little weird because you have intra-level classifications. So in between these groups, you have a group called the subphylum. And in that you have the hexapods, which are the insects and things related to insects. And you have the myriapods, which are the things with many legs, hence the name myriapods. So centipedes and millipedes, and you have the chelicerates, Chelicerata, Cerata. Chelicerata are the things with chelicerae, so they are the spiders and the scorpions, things like that. And then you have the crustaceans, which is actually it's its whole big group, and we'll get into that when we get into the specifics of the arthropods, because it becomes a really crazy evolutionary story of the crustaceans. But we're mostly interested in the insects, and then we get into all the orders of insects. So then you'll have the bees, so that's the Hymenoptera, the Odonata, everything like that. So for the majority of this course, we're going to be talking about these three levels here. So you have the very largest grouping that we're interested in is the phylum Arthropoda, and then we're going to be talking, so that was what we'll be talking about in the next couple of lectures. Then we're going to spend pretty much all of our time talking about the taxonomy of insects and their relevant orders. So this is really what we're going to be talking about here. So when we're talking about things like order Hymenoptera, so this is all the bees and wasps. If we were really interested in talking about that, we could talk about family Apidae, which are specifically the bees. And then maybe we would talk about genus Apis and species Mellifera. Apis mellifera is the honeybee. So we have the genus and the species. So when we talk about what a species is, we always give the genus and the species combined. So Apis mellifera is the honeybee. But all of the things which are related to honeybees, like closely related, would fall into genus Apis. And then all of the cousins, as it were, that are related to the Apis genus would fall into family Apidae, if that makes sense. So over here, we can kind of talk about that a little bit. So when we're talking about like an order within the insects, so we have the various orders here, but we're going to be talking about the Hymenoptera specifically for this example. We have the Hymenoptera, and these are all the wasps, bees, and ants, right? So we are starting at this level here, order Hymenoptera. So it already assumes that we're talking about class Insecta, phylum Arthropoda, kingdom Animalia, and domain Eukaryota. And I realize that we're jumping around quite a bit, but why I want to bring up why we're talking about the wasps and bees, starting with this example. So frequently, if you look through the history of taxonomy, there were a lot of different people in a lot of different countries working on the classification of various animals and plants. And things can get a little crazy when we're talking about the higher order taxonomic rankings. So when I say higher order taxonomic rankings, I'm talking about these rankings up here. And by crazy, I mean you have a lot of different people in a lot of different countries speaking a lot of different languages that come up with different names for things. So a long time ago with Carl Linnaeus, the biologist kind of adopted his system of binomial nomenclature, which means we always talk about a genus and a species when we're talking about insects, and we tend to name them in either Latin or Greek. But at the higher orders, things had lots of different names from common usage. It wasn't very well decided how the categories were going to be named, what the categories were going to be, things like that. Over the years, we ended up settling into a system of using specific suffixes on words in order to be able to communicate with each other what level of taxonomic ranking we are talking about. Technically, at the order and things like suborder, so these are classifications below order but above family. So there are these intermediate classifications in between the major classifications. So like family, genus, and species, order, these are major classifications. But because there's so many species, especially of insects, when we're talking about characterizing them together, we frequently talk about subcategories or supercategories. So for instance, families can be, if you don't want to talk about everything within the family Hymenoptera, but you want to talk about more than just one family, maybe you're going to be talking about a suborder or a superfamily. And these are not necessarily standardized, these subcategories, but they are just bins of similar families of insects combined together in order to talk about characteristics that they have, or evolutionary relationships between them. But anyway, going back. So when we were talking about these higher orders of taxonomy, we wanted to standardize things so that we could communicate across cultures and across regions and across languages what group we were talking about. There is no formal standardization of the suffixes for insect orders, but there is a formal characterization of what those insect orders are. However, now that I say that, most insect orders will end in terra. Hymenoptera. Terra means wing, so most of the insects end with most of the insect orders end with a reference to the wing. So Hymenoptera, I believe, is wasted wing, And you have like Lepidoptera, Lepidoptera, which is scaled wing, and you have the Coleoptera, which is the shield wing. So there is some, order in the madness, as it were. But most, not all, because you have something like the Odonata, which are the dragonflies, and they don't follow that. But most insect orders will end in Terra. So there is some pattern in that. After that, when we're talking about these taxonomic rankings, superfamily, family, subfamily, and tribe, there are definite rules for how they end. So superfamilies always end in oidea. We don't talk a ton about superfamilies in this particular lecture series, but we will talk a lot about families. With animals, all families end in ide, or id, depending on how people are pronouncing it. So for the bees, already have it written. I'm an idiot. It's apidae. For ants, it's formicidae. For like yellow jacket wasps, it's vespidae. So they all end in this id. So that's true for all animals. We use this for. So what would be another one? So like for beetles, scarabs are Scarabiidae. There's the id. What would for Canidae? Can you figure that one out? So these are the dogs and the wolves. What would be the other ones? So I think it's Ursidae. These are the bears. So id is the familial ending. And in entomology, we spend a lot of time talking about families because there are a ton of insect families. Just within the beetle, I want to say in beetles, there's almost 300 insect families. Like there's just an enormous number of insect families. Under the subfamily or under the families, you might have groups of subfamilies. So in this case, they end in ine or ine. So apinae would be the subfamily of honeybees within the apids. And then tribes are sometimes talked about. This is not something that you are going to see a lot in like a taxonomy course, but ine, so the apine. And then finally you have genus and species. So the genus and species are almost always in Latin or Greek. So in this case, Apis mellifera. Mellifera refers to honey. So that's where that comes from. So they're honeybees. And then underneath species, you can actually have a lot of continuous categorization. So you might have subspecies. You might have a what would it be? A variant. You might have a race. You might have a regional variant, things like that. A variety. Depending on the taxonomist that you're talking about, the number of subcategories of species can be pretty extensive, and that's especially true for plants. Plants have a ton of subspecies and smaller variations because of things like cultivars, and it just gets really crazy with plants. But generally speaking, when you're talking about genus and species, once you've named it once, genus will just be abbreviated, and then you put the species after it. So a good one would be like the green June beetle. We had him flying around here all summer. Is Catinus nitida. So after I've told you it's Catinus nitida, I might just refer to it as C nitida. And it's the same for subspecies. Once you've referred to it, once you know everyone knows what you're talking about, it can be abbreviated further, as it were. So I know this is a little much. It looks like a hot mess, but just remember that when we're talking about characterization or the evolutionary relationship and evolutionary nomenclature or taxonomic nomenclature of animals, we're talking about its relationship to other categories. So everything that exists within a lower category has to have all of the characteristics of the category above it. So, for instance, the ones that are most common are like Homo sapiens.
So in animals you'll have, or in humans you in humans you have Homo sapiens, or in humans. Humans are known as Homo sapiens, right? Uh, so you'll have down here, this is Homo sapiens is the specific epithet. So above that, this would be hominids, hominidae, and above that is primates. This would be like class Vertebrata. I don't know if that's considered a recognized class anymore. And then you have Chordata. So it's the Homo sapiens that belongs to with all the other hominids. These are the flat-faced primates, the apes that are primates. So they have thumbs and fur, things like that, which belongs to things with backbones, the vertebrates. So these are things with hardened bones, which have which are part of chordata, which are the things that have spinal cords, which are a type of animal, which is a type of eukaryote. So it's this rolling classification of once I tell you that this belongs to this family, if you know all of the other higher categorizations, you know all of these other characteristics that it has off the bat. I realize this is a hot mess, but it's just a stream of thought so that I could communicate with you guys. The next time, what we're going to be talking about, which will be limiting our discussion to cladograms, and then we're going to be specifically just talking about stuff in these three levels: the phylum, the class, and the order. So the characteristics of phylum Arthropoda. So we won't be talking about all these non-arthropod animals anymore. So until then, I'll talk to you guys later.